Hello everyone and welcome to Spoiler Warning, pre-recorded today because there's a few things to get through and I have a few other commitments to be jumping into as well. It'll still be going out at the usual time of the premiere, so those who want to turn up and of course support, you're always very welcome to do so. We're not going to be going through the chat because ultimately we're not live today and there's only a few bits I really want to cover before we really dive into the world of wrestling that we will really be covering on Monday. So our headlines today will be largely in and around Roman Reigns, the big return that he's had, the return of Andrade to AEW, some big changes with New Japan and TNA, as well as a little bit on Ronda Rousey. We're also going to have to talk a little bit on wrestling as a whole right now, because I think it is now fair to say the wrestling boom has kind of come to an end. The boom that started with the arrival of AEW, that continued with Vince McMahon leaving the company. There's a lot of ground we have to cover, but that boom ain't exactly booming as much as it previously was. So, before we get into that though, let's start with Roman Reigns. Now, Roman Reigns returned as expected on Raw. We spoke about this during Spoiler Warning, and while I couldn't confirm he was going to be at that show in particular, we did know that he was going to be back very shortly in time for War Games. Roman Reigns has returned to begin the inevitable build to the War Games match that will feature him, the Usos, and others teaming together to work against Seth Rollins and The Vision. Now, my expectation is that we might actually see Jimmy Uso on the side of Seth Rollins here. There is a very clear split being played, and the WWE have no intention of Roman Reigns being the heel. Those days are officially over. So I do kind of suspect we might end up with a Jimmy Uso on the side of The Vision. There's also potentially room for Jacob Fatu to step into that void and join Roman on his team. Jacob Fatu is in need of a bit of a resurgence after a bit of time away, but absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I wouldn't be too surprised to see him pop up to face Sami Zayn very shortly. Fun fact on this one, PW Insider were reporting after Roman Reigns returned that he was going to return. They were reporting that he was always going to be back after he finished filming for Street Fighter. That is indeed how time works. You can only return after you've been away. People pay for this. They genuinely do. Andrade has returned to AEW, and his AEW return has put AEW kind of firmly into second place here. There's a number of wrestlers that have been released over the last few years by AEW because they show no interest in being there. Rusev was one of them, formerly known as Miro in AEW. Aleister Black, much the same. Rey Fenix also got to that point. But the rub of the green is not exactly with those individuals. Rey Fenix has been bouncing around, losing quite a few matches that he appeared in. Rusev has had sort of the best run so far, but without Sheamus losing to him, it wouldn't exactly have been tremendous either. Andrade, that didn't work. That was poor. That was bad. So Andrade returning to AEW is no big surprise to me. It has upset quite a few people, primarily the fact that Tony Khan has taken him back after Andrade was burning bridges before he left, but we are where we are, and Tony Khan was apparently open to the idea of a rescue for Andrade. It also means that it continues this concept that if someone is not doing particularly well in WWE, maybe it is worth chancing your hand at AEW and seeing what you can do. The same is true the other way around. We are now closer to that point where WWF and WCW had, where they were trading people almost on a month-by-month basis. Jeff Jarrett never becomes a world heavyweight champion if he hadn't bounced back and forth 5 or 6 times. The Road Dogg, Jesse James, was going to WCW to ask for a job the day that they were bought out and Shane McMahon was walking the halls. So these things do happen. However, Tony Khan's been canny here. He's not just let Andrade come back and said, yes, whatever you want. Andrade has apparently come back on severely reduced wages from when he left. This is a case of the grass not being any greener on the other side, and I honestly applaud Tony Khan for being intelligent about this and making sure that wrestlers who do return have to be a bit more realistic with the demands that they make. A brief note on New Japan. There's been some reports flying around that New Japan isn't as competitive as it once was, and this is true. And the reason for this is that New Japan is apparently exercising a new strategy when it comes to their intended target audience. They are withdrawing from the international stage. They do not believe at this point in time they have any stars that really have that crossover value. They no longer have the Will Ospreays. They no longer have the Jay Whites. And where they are at the moment isn't quite giving them, Dave Finlay, what they were hoping for. The same can be said of Zack Sabre Jr. With this in mind, and with some elements of new management, they're looking at a new strategy of basically Japan first. Focusing on the market in which they are incredibly strong, making enough money without necessarily breaking the bank. They've also been burned before in partnerships with AEW and TNA. New Japan did want to continue their excursion protocol, which allows wrestlers who are developing to work in different areas like AAA, like TNA, like AEW, but this apparently has not really worked out over the most recent years. And the deal with AEW didn't work out with New Japan at all. So they are said to be withdrawing from the international stage at this point. There is speculation that Ronda Rousey is planning a UFC return. There has been talk of discussions with TKO, and these are apparently taking place, with Ronda Rousey having checked in with TKO a couple of months ago and things going relatively well there. However, her bridge burning with the WWE has soured her position heavily. She only recently went on a podcast and badmouthed pretty much everyone in an attempt to distance herself from the company. TKO has paid attention to these things, and she apparently owes quite a few apologies if she wants back in that particular fold. Triple H is one who would voice his concern heavily. He is not eager to have Ronda Rousey back in any form, even though it wouldn't technically be with his company. However, Dana White is said to be extremely open to it. Before I get into the next topic, I do just want to point out the Discord is going to be in the description. I'm going to make sure a Discord link lands in the description. Please do check that out. We are going to be doing a lot more on Discord, and the more people are there, the more we can communicate with it. These shows are a little less sporadic nowadays, but there are certainly moments when I want to discuss the videos that we're putting out. I want an audience ready to go, because notifications don't really seem to be working at the moment. So please make sure you are in the Discord and signed up to the wrestling section, where we can make sure you are aware as we go live, to make sure you're aware of our posts on the community page, and to make sure that you're aware of everything we are trying to do to make sure that the YouTube channel thrives. The last thing I just want to discuss before we wrap up, and this will be going in more in depth in the podcast tomorrow, or to be fair with the podcast next week. I'm not sure whether to make them a Saturday podcast or a Tuesday podcast. I don't know. Chances are I'll have to rethink that as we go and work out what we're doing. But I want to talk about the fact that the wrestling bubble has burst. Full on burst. And even companies like Netflix are very aware of it. Warner Brothers Discovery are very aware of it. Ratings are down. And it's not just a case of this is a period where they are down, even though it is. Ratings for AEW have been struggling. Ratings for TNA, they were hoping to get a significant boost from more NXT and WWE talent. That has not really materialized, even though ticket sales have increased. We're also seeing New Japan, previously a real force, withdrawing from that scene. We're seeing wrestlers start to struggle to find jobs again, whereas previously AEW was hoovering up talent, and we're seeing podcasters like myself having very different shaped platforms. Now, the wrestling boom essentially started with Cody Rhodes and Tony Khan having an idea that they could convince Pac, could convince Jericho, could convince Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks to get involved with. AEW presented a viable alternative, which got people invested in wrestling who had lapsed pretty heavily. That brought back viewers who were tired after years of watching Vince McMahon's WWE. Not only that, but shortly afterwards, Vince McMahon, in shame, was forced to leave the WWE, with Triple H then coming in, furthering this boom, bringing back once again all those fans who couldn't find wrestling that suited them. Suddenly we had genuine investment in TNA, in New Japan, in Major League Wrestling. Suddenly everybody knew who Jacob Fatu was. This boom was serious, and it did lead to Cody Rhodes becoming one of the biggest names in wrestling, to Chris Jericho extending his career long past what many people thought it would be, to huge platforms being offered for people like Kazuchika Okada, Will Ospreay, to a viable alternative for Sasha Banks, who didn't feel like she was getting what she needed in WWE, giving Naomi a platform on which to stand while she came back to herself, to prove to WWE that she was more than what they were giving her. This bubble has now burst. It's not just when it comes to the ratings, it's also the wrestlers themselves. Job opportunities are starting to diminish because WWE is no longer trying to be as competitive. They're releasing more wrestlers. AEW is recognizing that it can't be as competitive. They're releasing more wrestlers. Suddenly, everyone who was willing to splash the cash is no longer willing to do so. Everyone now is looking for profit, and AEW still aren't quite there because the ticket sales have started to dry up, because they can't fill arenas the way they were doing, because Wembley didn't make them money. Wrestling is in an interesting position right now, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. As I say, I'll go into this in more depth in the podcast as it comes up, but when it comes to wrestling, particularly with the Saudi deal, WWE are only interested in making money. AEW have to be more interested in making money because they've spent years not interested at all, and it's costing them. TNA have tried a multitude of things to make them more profitable, to make them more appealing to TV deals. It's not really working. The Netflix deal for WWE has essentially been the end of any attempt at competition, and wrestling in general, it's not appointment viewing anymore. Tony Khan is no longer pushing huge announcements. Triple H's whole idea of wrestling television is devoid of the shock factor that Vince McMahon made famous. Wrestling has changed in the last few years, and people seem to have stopped caring about it. The people around me that I would chat to about wrestling, they're not as invested anymore. They know Roman Reigns ain't going to be there, even though he was such a huge part of it. They know John Cena's coming to an end, and while you've got huge stars coming up like Rhea Ripley as an example, like Gunther, like Jacob Fatu, they're not there yet. And so we focus very much on a Seth Rollins, on a Becky Lynch, who certainly have their fans, but we're missing people like Bianca Belair. Over in AEW, the stars that you attach yourself to, MJF, Adam Cole, Bay, have been missing. And while they still have big names like Tony Storm, who've done wonderful things for the company, the CM Punk element that really boosted AEW to that top level started a bit of a tirade. Punk went, Cody Rhodes went, and it's gotten a little bit more quiet when it comes to the building of new stars. TNA is struggling to have anyone that you'd say is a huge name in wrestling. Even though they have some huge names, I'd argue the Hardy Boys are the biggest names there, and they're simply not huge names in wrestling anymore. So when it comes to crossover potential, when it comes to those crossover stars, we're relying on a lot of people watching this Street Fighter film. We really are. Again, I'd love to know your thoughts, but for me, that bubble has burst, and it's time to start talking about it without being ashamed to say it. So I thought I'd just get in there early and start discussing it. Give me your thoughts. I'll read some out for the podcast when we get to that. But for now, being up for about 15 minutes. Without the chat, this is usually how long I would expect it to go. Make sure you're in the Discord. I will be back on Monday, but I just thought for tonight, with a few other things that need to be done, and we've not that much news to cover, this was probably the perfect way to do it. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as we get to it. But thanks, guys. I've been Tom Collier. You've been fantastic, and I'll see you all very soon.